Imagine scrolling through your feed, seeing yet another viral think piece dissecting millennial behavior. They talk about TikTok addictions, the desperate need for participation trophies, and the reality of growing up with a smartphone practically glued to your hand. And you just stare at the screen, feeling absolutely nothing. According to every demographic chart, you belong in that exact same bracket, born between 1981 and 1986. Technically, society demands that you claim the millennial label, but when the culture holds up that mirror, the reflection staring back at you feels completely alien. You don't feel defensive, you don't get angry, you just feel out of place, like they're talking about a completely different species. Let's take a trip back for a second. Think about who you really are. You are the kid who remembers the tactile, satisfying clunk of a VHS tape sliding into a VCR. You know the high stakes, gut-wrenching adrenaline of calling your middle school crush's landline, praying to God their dad wouldn't be the one to pick up. You survived long, agonizing summer afternoons fueled by nothing but hose water, neighborhood exploration, and the absolute, unspoken law that you had to be back in your driveway before the streetlights flickered on. Your childhood wasn't curated. It wasn't broadcasted to a cloud server. It was gritty, private, and beautifully boring. And here is the profound psychological secret of your specific age group. You developed your core identity in the dark. By the time the world went digital, the concrete of your personality had already dried. You already knew exactly who you were, long before anyone could hit a like button on it. And then, the world split in half. You were 12, maybe 14, when the heavy CRT monitor in your family room glowed to life. You remember the screeching, robotic symphony of a dial-up modem, struggling to connect you to AOL. Unlike the younger millennials, you didn't grow up inside the digital ecosystem. No, you were the pioneer who stepped across the border. You learned the new rules of the internet in real time. You meticulously crafted ARM-away messages and waited hours for a single song to download. But underneath it all, you always knew it was just a secondary reality. You still possessed the rare superpower of knowing how to unplug. You still remembered how to disappear. But the moment you try to distance yourself from the millennial stereotype, you hit another wall. You aren't Generation X either. You were just a little too young to fully absorb the heavy, cynical grunge era of the early 90s. You didn't carry that hardened, ironic detachment, or the true latchkey kid rebellion born out of the Cold War. So, where does that leave you? Floating in a generational ghost town. You are the Elder Millennial, the bridge, the phantom generation living in the gap between a fully analog history and a hyper-digital future. For years, you've probably wondered why you feel so profoundly disconnected from the very labels society tries to force on you. But I need you to know right now, it's not just a quirk of your personality. It's not just nostalgia playing tricks on you. This sense of generational homelessness is a highly specific, scientifically measurable psychological phenomenon. And today, we are going to unpack exactly why your mind was forged entirely differently than anyone who came before you and anyone who came after. To truly understand the architecture of your mind, we have to look at the massive demographic tectonic plates grinding against you on either side. Because to grasp who you are, you first have to acknowledge what you are not. Let's look over your left shoulder at Generation X. Born between 1965 and 1980, they were forged in the fires of genuine, systemic anxiety. These were the ultimate latchkey kids. They came of age in an era defined by economic stagnation, Cold War paranoia, and a front-row seat to watching trusted American institutions visibly fail. The defining traits of Gen X, their biting, ironic detachment and aggressive self-sufficiency, were not just cultural fashion statements. They were psychological armor. They built those walls out of pure, childhood necessity to survive a world that felt fundamentally unreliable. You might share a sliver of their independence, but you were simply too young to inherit their deep-seated, survivalist cynicism. You still had a taste of that late-90 seconds optimism. Now, look over your right shoulder at the younger millennials, those born from roughly 1990 onward. These kids didn't just learn to use technology, they were incubated inside it. Imagine having your most awkward, vulnerable middle school years permanently etched into a digital public square. Social media crashed into their lives by the time they were 11 or 12. They were navigating Instagram filters before they were legally allowed to drive. Their self-worth, their social hierarchies, and their deepest sense of identity were photographed, quantified, and judged by an algorithm in real time. For them, a smartphone isn't a tool they picked up. It is the native habitat they grew up inside. And then, there is you, born right in the middle of that demographic crossfire, between 1981 and 1986. You are too young for the hardened grit of Gen X, and too old to have had your identity shaped by a digital audience. You are sitting directly on the hinge of the most violent sociological shift in human history. And what that specific, isolated position did to your brain is something clinical researchers are only just now beginning to unpack. In the world of behavioral science, there is a term for what you are experiencing. It's called a cohort effect. A cohort effect occurs when people born within a razor-thin window of time develop a psychology completely distinct from the groups standing right next to them. It proves that you aren't just being difficult, and you aren't making this alienation up. The historical and cultural weather you walked through during your most formative years was genuinely, measurably different. In this case, a gap of just 3 or 4 years was enough to create a psychological profile that has almost nothing in common with the rest of your supposed generation. For you, this cohort effect revolves around one defining, inescapable axis. You are the absolute last generation of human beings to have a fully analog childhood, and the very first to pioneer a digital adolescence. Think about the profound mental gymnastics that required. You spent your foundational years, the critical window where your core ego and self-esteem lock into place, playing in the physical world. You built a robust, private inner life without a single person watching. You learned how to be profoundly bored. You figured out who you were in the quiet spaces. Then, right as your teenage years hit, society handed you the internet. You navigated AIM chat rooms, burned mixed CDs with surgical precision, and watched your social life migrate into pixels. But here, the critical distinction that changes everything. You did not grow up inside the digital matrix. You walked into it. You were a fully formed tourist, exploring a brand new digital country. And that specific sequence of events, building a private self before ever encountering a public arena, hardwired your brain with a very specific kind of psychological resilience. But the technological whiplash is only half the story. We also have to talk about the brutal economic reality you walked into. Because you didn't just inherit a fractured culture, you inherited a financial minefield. Think back to the years between roughly 2003 and 2008. The exact moment you were supposed to be stepping out into the world, shaking off your college years, and laying the bricks for your independent adult life. What did you get? You stepped out of the shadow of the dot-com collapse, straight into the teeth of the 2008 Great Recession. Society handed you a mountain of student loan debt, gutted entry-level salaries, and absolutely zero safety net, maximum exposure, minimum cushion. And if you've ever felt like you've been playing financial catch-up your entire adult life, science completely validates you. According to landmark research published in the Journal of Political Economy by economists Hans Schwant and Till von Wachter, entering the workforce during that specific recession wasn't just a temporary bump in the road. It created a measurable earnings deficit that dragged on for more than a decade. After the market supposedly recovered, it was a permanent recalibration of your wealth, your career trajectory, and your peace of mind. The bad timing of your beginning actively haunted your future. But here is where the framing completely shifts. Because what looks like a generation caught in the crossfire, battered by a chaotic economy, and split between 2 centuries, is actually your greatest psychological asset. In behavioral science, this incredibly rare trait has a name. It is called dual fluency. Because you didn't grow up inside the modern attention economy, you don't fundamentally require its validation to survive. You know exactly what it feels like to be completely unreachable. And more importantly, you understand the heavy psychological cost of being constantly plugged in. Your self-worth wasn't constructed in front of a live studio audience, which means it cannot be easily dismantled by one. You watch the digital arena being built from the outside in, allowing you to choose exactly how much of your soul you wanted to hand over to it. Psychologists who study extreme resilience consistently find that people who are forced to navigate 2 entirely different cultural systems develop profound cognitive flexibility. You had to learn the old school, analog rules of the 20th century and then completely pivot to master the hyper-digital demands of the 21st. What does that kind of fluency produce? It builds a human being who's incredibly difficult to destabilize. You are comfortable holding ambiguity. When the environment changes without warning, you don't panic. You adapt. You are not the generation that got lost between the labels. You are the generation that learned how to thrive without needing one. Every other generation gets a neat little box, a defining crisis, catchy headline that travels ahead of them into every room. For a long time, the lack of a clear label probably felt like a void, like you were missing a piece of the puzzle. But the truth is, the people who live on the seam between two worlds develop a superpower that the people safely sitting at the center will never understand. You know how to move through both realities, not as a spectator, but as a native. You never needed the label to know who you were. You already knew exactly who you were before the internet even had a name for it. If this video finally put words to a feeling you've been carrying around in your chest for decades, hit that subscribe button. We are dissecting the generations that the mainstream media keeps getting completely wrong. And if this hit close to home, you are definitely going to want to watch this next video. Right here, the psychology of baby boomers. We are going to look at the exact generation that raised you, why they operate the way they do, and what their world actually looked like from the inside out. I'll see you there. If this finally put language to a feeling you've been carrying around in the dark for years, hit that subscribe button. We are going to keep dissecting the psychological truths and generational experiences that the mainstream conversation keeps getting completely wrong. You might not fit neatly into a demographic box, but your story deserves to be understood. Drop a comment below and let me know the exact moment you realized you were living between two worlds. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.